Before I get into the finer details of this story, it's been nearly 2 years since the incident, so I'll try to recount the events as best I can, although I've tried to forget about it since. Also, just a heads up to anyone who doesn't cope well in long, narrow spaces, I wouldn't recommend working at the kind of establishment in which this story takes place. After graduating university, I'd spent nearly a whole year applying for jobs in the media industry, specifically film and television based, but all to no avail. I'd almost given up hope by then until one day my mum informed me there would be a field engineer required to work evening shifts for a period of 2 to 3 months at the firm she worked at, and they needed applicants ASAP. I was slightly skeptical about it at first, seeing as I had no previous experience in IT and computer science, but she assured me that it would be manual handling such as removing and replacing cables, and that I should send my CV in while I had the chance. It sounded simple enough, plus the hourly rate was too good to be true, so without hesitation I applied. 3 weeks later, I was fortunate enough to be accepted and commenced my 2 8-hour day shifts per week. The job started out pretty well, accessing the data hall to check the wiring frames and handling cables. Very easygoing work. The data hall itself though could be slightly unsettling at times. The overhead lights in each aisle were motion censored and would go out every 5 minutes or so depending on your proximity, leaving nothing but patches of pure blackness. You could also become so accustomed to the sound of the AC fans that you'd eventually drown them out, making noises from elsewhere more apparent. Plus you'd get the occasional jolt from walking into someone at the hall corners. This didn't bother me so much in the beginning. Being a horror movie enthusiast, it takes some doing to scare us. However, about a month into the job, things began to get really eerie. I was working one of the night shifts with Mick, a fellow colleague. He had to shoot off early as he had kids to look after, and I assured him I'd be fine going about it solo and that there was enough work to keep me occupied for the remaining time. About 15 minutes after Mick left the data hall, I was plucking away at one of the wiring frames when I began to hear a strange noise coming from the dark, far end of the hall. I couldn't make it out, something between a footstep and a trot, awkwardly paced. I turned my head in the direction of the noise before calling out, "Mick, Mick, is that you?" But there was no response. By the time the sound had ceased, I'd put down the cables I was holding, got out my pocket torch and made my way over to the far corner, with the lights above illuminating the path behind me. When I got to the far end, I found nothing. No sign of anybody having been there. Despite the baffling nature of the situation, I shrugged it off and called it a night. The following week came and I was back into my work. I was informed by Carl, the security guard, that Mick wouldn't be in this week due to family matters, and that I'd be working solo as a result. It came across as sketchy at first, as I didn't really like it after what I heard last time, and it was still on my mind if I'm to be honest, but I trusted his word and went ahead with the shift. I'd say I spent about 4 hours in the data hall. It was during the 4 hours that I heard the all too familiar sound coming from the far end of a nearby aisle. It was the trotting foot noise. What followed it next was even more unsettling. I could only describe it as a low, almost demonic baritone purr. What the fuck was that? I thought to myself. I slowly and quietly crept over to the aisle with my torch in hand and a shiver creeping down my spine. Once I got into the aisle, I peeked around to see what was down the other end. There was only blackness, until I turned on the torch and raised it up to reveal something shocking. What I saw, if only for half a second, was a pair of thin hind legs. The shiver in my spine suddenly intensified before the legs walked off to the side and out of sight. There wasn't any time for me to make out any more than what I just described, but I proceeded to power walk, then jog down the aisle with the lights illuminating above me. I got to the end of the aisle, but I found nothing, and in a state of overwhelming panic, I quickly made my way over to the security office and knocked on the door. Carl, the security guard, opened up with a slight look of concern on his face, probably because it looked like I'd just seen a ghost, and asked me, "Something wrong, Louis?" I asked Carl, "Has anybody else been in the data hall, because I'm sure I saw something or somebody else down there." He assured me that he'd been watching the monitors the whole time and that I was the only one in there. I was hesitant, but I nervously replied, "Oh, okay then," and didn't really know what to do after that. I didn't want to go back into the data hall, so I spent the rest of my day up in main offices trying to calm my nerves and process what I'd just seen. On the drive home, it kept replaying over and over again in my mind. What was it that I saw? And why wasn't it illuminating the lights like I was when I was walking up and down the aisle? The time had rolled around again for my next shift, and against my better judgment, I decided to work it. It may have seemed unwise at the time to do so, but I needed every penny I could earn, plus it was the last shift of the working week, and I could have several days to have a break and relax afterward. I wish I had just gone home that evening and never came back, because what I seen next and what happened next was something that I would never forget to this day. Also, I should note, I'd be working solo again, as Mick was still away on family matters, which didn't really help my situation and made it even more eerie for me. Upon entering the data hall, although I was scared out of my mind and knew that I was going to be working alone, I wanted as much light as possible. I started roaming each aisle from one end to the other, figuring that I'd get enough light to last me 15 to 20 minutes until the next lap. But then after getting not even a quarter of the way around, it hit me. From that point on, none of the lights would come on. I was both shocked and confused now. After a couple of minutes of pondering, I foolishly brushed it off and went about untangling cables on one of the corner frames. A solid hour had gone by at this stage and things seemed to be going swimmingly, despite the lack of light. However, only a few moments later, my ears picked up the most disturbing sound, an all too familiar one that I've spoken about before and leaves chills down my spine. It felt like a punch to the gut. It was the demonic purring and trotting noise coming from the far end of the hall, only louder this time. I hugged the wiring frames while shaking in fear. What I saw next will haunt me forever. Until this day, I still can't get this image out of my head. Stupidly, out of morbid curiosity, I stuck my head out of the corner frame and saw something standing at the far corner of the outer aisle. Stood there, in the darkness, was a silhouette of a figure with those hind legs, a broad muscular upper body, and a pair of glowing red eyes, staring directly at me. It felt like an anvil had been dropped and crushed my ribcage as I stood frozen stiff, paralyzed with fear. After a few seconds, which honestly felt like minutes, the creature or whatever it was began to approach me out of the darkness with trembling steps. I was unable to move immediately though, as I was still frozen stiff with fear. The creature could only make it about halfway before I finally snapped out of it, bolted through the hall, down the corridor, past the security office, out the front doors, and hopped into my car like a madman and sped home. Once I got home, my mum was still up, and she seen the look on my face as I staggered through the door. She looked instantly concerned before I started to tell her about what happened, and she tried to calm me down. I could tell she was skeptical and probably thought that the better part of my imagination was getting to me, but she did say that she would look into it when she returned to work. The following day, after seemingly endless hours without sleep, we were informed by Carl, the security guard, that I was the only person in the data hall that night, as he'd been monitoring the security cameras and was able to look back on the footage. This was an uneasy feeling because I knew what I seen, but now nobody was believing me and I would have to face this ordeal on my own with the images in my head of what I'd seen. Although I just had this ordeal and tried to explain my best about what I'd seen, seeing as there was no proof, my mum still did want me to work this job as I did really need the money, but I made the informed decision that day to never return and threw the towel in on my job. I have since been fortunate enough, however, to get a job as a sound engineer for a local production company, and I have undergone some counselling at the request of my mum. I enjoy the work I do now, and the atmosphere is refreshing and pleasant. The supposed hallucinations have ceased for some time now. To this day though, the meaning behind the incident has remained unclear, with nothing more to be discovered. Then again, I guess some things are best left that way.